Okay, welcome back. Today we are talking about DUI laws or DWI laws, however you wanted to define it. We are going to be discussing the role, the validity, efficacy of the laws pertaining to driving or operating a motor vehicle while intoxicated.
That's right. The act or crime of driving while affected by alcohol or drugs, although one could say that other kinds of driving, such as tired driving, could be lumped into this. But the way that the government in pretty much all states in the United States define it as specifically related to alcohol or drugs.
Okay, so let's hear a little bit about the history of these kinds of laws because as looking back over your notes for this discussion, I was surprised actually by how far back the history begins for these laws.
Well, that's right. The it really starts almost with the car industry, the auto industry itself, with the progressive haven of New York passing the first DUI law in the country, actually in 1910. But there was no set level of intoxication which was allowed or disallowed. So that would be like blood alcohol content as we know it today. The law basically said, well, you can't drive while intoxicated. So it was a very primitive law compared to what we have. But then in 1938, the first blood alcohol content law was basically started to be used at that point, and it was 0.15, which is pretty high compared to what it is today. And then 1953, the breathalyzer was invented, and that obviously made enforcing the previous law much easier, of course. And the breathalyzer today is still commonly used by law enforcement. 1984, the National Minimum Drinking Age Act required states to pass individual laws mandated that they would mandate the drinking age of 21. And if the states did not enact this law, their highway funds were reduced by 10%. So it was basically a case of do as I say or else. Um,
And up to that point, it was this blood alcohol content level was regulated completely by the states. Is that correct?
that is correct. And the drinking age varied among states as well. So, for instance, prior to 1984, New York State, the minimum drinking age was 18, whereas, say, to the south of Pennsylvania, it was 21. And it was always 21 since the end of Prohibition. But it was pretty quiet with drunk driving laws until the year 2000, where Congress enacted a national limit of zero point zero 0.08 blood alcohol content, and that was adopted by all the states in order for the states to keep their federal highway funds, they had to adopt it.
So once
Um,
again, the federal funds were kind of the coercive method, for better or for worse.
right, and interestingly enough, there's been no constitutional challenge to that, but it seems like an encroachment on the Ninth or Tenth Amendment, but that's a different discussion. So in the year 2000 was kind of the last major national DUI law that we see. And today, the various DUI laws that we see are basically up to the state. Some states are, states like Pennsylvania are considered some of the most lax when it comes to DUI laws. Other states, such as Alabama or New York, are considered some of the strictest.
Okay. So, do these laws work? And I believe that your premise is that they do not work. So, why don't you build a little bit of the case for that? Why would you say that this is very something for most people? I mean, we have entire organizations that are dedicated to eliminating um, the act of driving while intoxicated. So, why is it that obviously we're not going to neither of us are going to endorse the idea of driving while intoxicated here. It's irresponsible. You shouldn't do it. But from the standpoint from state involvement, or the state, not necessarily states, but the government involvement, why is it a problem to have laws that are going to have punishments for people that are driving while intoxicated?
Well, first, I would like to express my sympathies to anybody, and let's be honest, most people, no matter where they live, if they live in any uh, society, Western society with cars, uh, most people have been affected by, in some way, whether personally or they know somebody who has been affected by DUI. So this is sort of the point of me bringing this issue up, is because I care so deeply about them that I want to see a better outcome for people. So in no way am I endorsing driving while being intoxicated. That's crazy. So I just want to get that out of the way, because when most people, if you're anti something, then they assume you're automatically for the opposite, and that's not necessarily the case. So
Certainly, yes, and I do appreciate that you clarify that, because in any of these discussions, if we're making a case for something, it does not necessarily mean that the extreme opposite, or that if we're making a case against something, that we're endorsing the extreme opposite, or just critiquing what's going on in this system with the DUI laws right now.
well, that's right. For my friends on the left, it would be like someone saying, "Well, if you're against the war on drugs, then you must be for people, dying from heroin in the streets." Or for my friends on the right, it's like, if you're against if you're against welfare, then you're for little children starving in the streets. I mean, it's a fallacy to think that. But I just wanted to get that out of the way.
Certainly. So that being out of the way, we know that nobody here is endorsing, and, and if you make a stupid decision, don't write this channel and and complain about
Right.
it. We're not endorsing, and I personally I have taken the policy of, and I went away from this for a while, but when I was younger, I had a policy of one drink and don't drive, and I've gone back to that, and I really do think that that's a good place to start. So that's my little motivational speech for anybody out there. It really is important to us. I've had a few close calls, and when I was acting stupid, I know people around me who have had worse than close calls. So let's just be the responsible ones and say don't do it at all. But if we're going to be talking about state involvement, what should we be talking about regarding these laws?
Well, first, the blood alcohol content threshold that was lowered in 2000 to, remember, to zero point zero 0.08. Alcohol-related traffic fatalities increased after declining for 20 years. But it's important to note that this is a correlational. These are correlational statistics. There is no causation.
Right.
But
That was
one,
the one thing I was going to bring up when I was reviewing the show notes, was that a lot of these studies are correlational. So we do want to be careful to differentiate that we're not saying this is necessarily causal, but keeping in the context of social sciences and methodology, we can see, okay, there's a correlation here. There may be a connection, so we can kind of expand upon a discussion of what that connection might be.
right, and with that said, because there's no studies that show, no accurate studies that determine that stricter DUI laws result in less alcohol related, not even alcohol related, we'll get to that term in a minute, but just alcohol fatalities. But for, say, in about 2005 or so, the deaths actually went down a bit, but at the same time, the deaths actually increased in the states that used roadblocks. Like, we're all probably familiar, if we drive, especially outside of major urban areas, we're all familiar with DUI checkpoints. And the deaths increased in states that heavily use roadblocks, or just use them in general.
Now,
And
that
that
is, I'm sorry.
Oh, just real quick, the overall drop that I'm speaking of came almost entirely from the handful of states that don't use roadblocks. And we'll get into roadblocks in a second, but go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just going to say that is a good clarification to make, because when I was looking at the data, and again, we'll put these sources in the description below, the data seems to indicate that there was a serious drop in alcohol-related fatalities on in vehicle fatalities right around 2000, and then after that, it pretty much remained stable. But the data that I'm looking at right now, which indicates that from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, that does not factor in what you're talking about, the use of checkpoints or DUI checkpoints. So that's a very good point to bring up.
Right, and that's. Did you have any more comments about that particular
Well,
study?
actually, not on this study, but I think that it's very interesting because there's a correlation here with another time in history, and that's prohibition, and it's very relevant to our conversation. Is that if you look at the data for prohibition, you will find that alcohol consumption was already on the decline before prohibition, and prohibition seemed to have very little effect on actual consumption. So it's interesting how oftentimes in history, and this wouldn't be the first, second, third, or 20th time this has happened, where there's already a trend that's taking place, and then at the kind of the tail end of the trend, the law comes in and says, let's make this a law instead of just it being a non-legal social trend.
Well, that's right. That is the one of the tools in the arsenal of the state is that it basically coattails on culture. And if culture is, let's say, more accepting of homosexuality, then the state will come in after that to say, well, you can't discriminate against homosexuality. So it's the same case. It's in this situation. It's there. They see a decline in something, and then they play catch up to, and then they claim victory if there is a continued decrease. But in this case, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, stricter DUI laws may actually have the opposite effect. But I do want to point out that statistics on certainly on both sides, but at least the statistics from the standpoint of the federal government or the state or groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which is a neo-prohibition. They're neo-prohibitionists. It is not about drunk driving anymore. They are anti-alcohol completely. I just want to point that out. That the federal government defines any kind of, when you look up their statistics for alcohol-related fatalities, they actually define it based on relationships rather than causation. So they say that upwards of 40% of traffic deaths, fatalities every year, are alcohol-related, but that doesn't mean it's alcohol-caused. So if you look at their definition, that could be if somebody becomes intoxicated and is a pedestrian and walks out in front of a person and gets hit and killed who is safely driving without being intoxicated, that would be considered an alcohol-related accident.
Right.
And that is lumped in with the statistics, so even their own statistics are not, we don't know if that 40% is accurate. In fact, I would argue it's not. So it's entirely possible, and I would argue that it's likely that 30 to 40% that they cite is actually much lower when you look at alcohol-caused accidents.
And that's really getting to the heart of the issue here. Very important whenever we're looking at these kinds of cases, or any of the listeners out there listening that are interested in looking into specific topics. It's very important to get unbiased data, go for the raw data, because it's very unfortunate because a lot of these interest groups really do have good intentions, but they don't understand proper social science research, or they specifically manipulate it to better their cause in some kind of righteous fashion. But when you have interest groups, and it happens all the time, where they do use numbers incorrectly, it can give a very skewed picture of reality, and oftentimes the media uses and then replicates and sends off these messages to others as well. So I think it is important to mention that and we're using, again, the sources are in the description. We are using data that is less biased than that for these analyses.
Right, and that is important. And unfortunately, when it comes to a topic like this, one does need to sift through a lot of chaff to get to the true statistics. And it is kind of difficult to find because if you'd think you could go to a federal government website or a state website and find this information, but with the alcohol-related versus alcohol-caused accidents, you can't rely on that. You have to sift even further, and it's very vague and unclear what exactly is going on.
Certainly. So let's talk about the checkpoints.
Yeah, and before I do that, I just want to point out the logic or lack of logic in the case of just we'll get into more of this later, but I do want to just point out that for people who think that, and this goes along with checkpoints, but for people who think that DUI laws work, like if you pass a law that says you can't drink or uh, become intoxicated and drive, we all agree that somebody who does that lacks judgment and they lack a rational risk assessment. For a lot of people, it is more risky to do that. However, I would like to point out, and perhaps you can tell me if you agree, but I would like to point out that if these people lack judgment and a rational risk assessment, then we cannot expect them to also show judgment in refraining from drinking and driving due to punishments.
Now, I would partially agree with that, but I do not entirely agree, and this is the reason why, is I have seen people react to drinking situations differently because they know there are punishments involved. So some people take it upon themselves to be responsible on the highway with their alcohol consumption because they have a genuine care for themselves, their loved ones, their fellow citizens. But some people I have seen exhibit just a concern, maybe especially those who have already had problems with the law and they're concerned about losing their license, etc. So I do think that while laws like these are not going to prevent certainly all people from, especially the most irrational people, from committing these kinds of transgressions, we'll say, it does, I think, affect a certain percentage. There maybe is a 10 or 20% of the population kind of murky area where they're just rational enough to recognize that there are punishments, and that's enough to kind of sway them, but it's not going to affect the people who are so irrational that they just drink and do whatever they want. Their inhibitions are gone and they get on the highway and just don't care. But in addition to that, I would argue that the very act of taking away people's licenses will have a preventative effect in itself because you're removing these drivers from the road.
I'll agree with that generally, although the 10% or so that you refer to, uh, I would I would argue that those people are going to know their limits, and in the sense of if they become so intoxicated that they will not that they that they won't drive. So they'll have a sort of a leg up in rational assessment than a lot of people. So
Oh,
yeah,
certainly, but I would argue those people are probably more likely to just be the ones that say, I'm only having one or two drinks tonight, and they'll stop because they'll still be rational enough at that point to say, I know if I drink more, I could get a DUI and I need my license to get to work or something like that.
absolutely, I can agree with that. So yeah, let's talk about checkpoints because I think, like I said, most people, if you drive a lot, you may have encountered a checkpoint. I know I have in the past, and it's pretty scary, even if you've had nothing to drink, because it's a very nervous situation for most people. But it's important to point out that in 1990, the U.S. Supreme Court had a case, Michigan v. Sitz, and the court ruled that these checkpoints, and they were specifically about a DUI, but they covered any kind of checkpoint, that they were probably a violation of the Fourth Amendment, but public safety outweighs constitutional concerns, which is a little bizarre to me. I don't think that was ever rationalized well in the written conclusion from the majority side.
Wait, I'm just confused because I thought that the Constitution was supposed to preserve public safety.
Oh yeah. Well, apparently we need the Supreme Court to reinterpret things that are pretty clear to begin with. But yeah, and actually, just recently, the Supreme Court revisited checkpoints and did rule that breathalyzers are not violating the Fourth Amendment, but police taking you out of your vehicle and taking blood from you to check your level of intoxication is a violation.
Hmm.
I guess because the taking of blood is more inconvenient for the motorist, and therefore, apparently, convenience now determines whether the Constitution has been violated.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's just a little bizarre history there. But actually, I found the FBI actually argues that checkpoints are not that they're not that efficient. And a study by the National Institute of Health also shows that checkpoints are not efficient and productive. And they recommend police saturation, is what it's called, versus checkpoints. So this would be like, because at a checkpoint, perhaps I should have defined this to begin with, but a checkpoint is basically a fixated position in the road where upwards of 20 police officers are standing there, and you have to stop at this one at a time, this checkpoint, and the police will check to see if you're intoxicated. So they'll check your speech. They actually, in a lot of cases, won't ask you out of the car unless they suspect something. But the FBI and the National Institute of Health showed that saturation points are actually better. So, for instance, in a stretch of road that's maybe 30 miles long, there will be several police officers who are stationed on the side of the road like they would be to try to catch speeders. But all they would do is look for reckless driving. They wouldn't actually, there's no checkpoint, they won't pull everybody over. They just, a large number of police officers, more than usual, on certain times, maybe say on a holiday or a drinking occasion or a section of road that may have more drinkers, maybe it's by a strip of bars or restaurants, that those are actually more effective than checkpoints.
Interesting.
Absolutely. And why this is important is that checkpoints are the tool. There's 10 states that do not use checkpoints. Actually, it might be less by now. Most states use checkpoints, and the Supreme Court, obviously, like I previously said, did find them constitutional. So most states do use them, and it's one of the most widespread tools to catch intoxicated drivers. But what's interesting to note, and I found this, if you look at data from Mothers Against Drunk Driving website, the percentage of DUI fatalities in states with heavy checkpoint usage are on average no less than those with light or no use. So there's not even a correlation there between heavy checkpoint use and a decrease in alcohol related or caused fatalities.
So that sounds similar to what we'd see in the war on drugs, how states that have these zero tolerance policies don't seem to have much of a measurable difference in actual drug use.
Well, that's right. And another problem with checkpoints is we all know someone who can be drunk if they have less than 0.08 blood alcohol content, and someone can drive safely over that 0.08 blood alcohol content. It's all relative.
It is, but there's such ambiguity, and I've seen so many people who are obviously intoxicated who are convinced that they're not. And that's what makes it so insidious, because when you're intoxicated, it's very easy to convince yourself and others that you're not, and do something irresponsible.
Right, and everybody's situation is different in terms of how alcohol affects the body. So, a 300-pound man who just ate a full meal can drink significantly more than a 100-pound woman on an empty stomach, and they'll have different levels of blood alcohol content. The man, for instance, could have over zero point zero 0.08, but still drive perfectly safe, especially if that person is naturally a conservative driver. And so what happens is when these people go into these checkpoints and they get a breathalyzer, even if the breathalyzer says that they're past the limit, even if they're driving safely, I mean that raises problems because now all of a sudden that checkpoints are not so much about stopping drunk driving, but they're about a revenue generating tool for the police departments. And in fact, there are police officers and captains and sheriffs who do admit that they make more money from checkpoints from, say, oh, I pulled you over and you have a suspended license, or your tail light's out, I'm going to cite you, or, hey, we found something in your car that you shouldn't have. It's often has nothing to do with DUI, and it just goes to show that these checkpoints do not prevent drunk driving, and they aren't even really about drunk driving at this point.
I'll accept that point, and especially when you have certain states, there's been, it seems, a trend towards, in certain areas, at least the United States, the elimination of the need for a warrant to search somebody's car. So it makes it very easy for police, if you're at a checkpoint, to just come up with any reason for probable cause, and you can search if you're an unscrupulous type of police officer, and we're certainly not making the insinuation that most police are like this, but it does occur, that you might be interested in just kind of fleecing people and looking for things wrong to bring in revenue for the department or maybe get a promotion or something.
Well, that's right, and you'll notice that oftentimes, and it's not always the case, but oftentimes these checkpoints are heavily used during quota time because police officers are required, in a lot of departments, are required to have a certain number of citations as sort of a job performance evaluation, if that makes sense, which it doesn't to me, but absolutely.
Okay, so we know the checkpoints aren't that effective. So what else can we say about critiquing the DUI laws?
Well, in terms of, I would like to just go off of sort of what we see currently and just talk about them in general, the nature or the idea behind DUI laws, if you don't mind.
Sure. Theoretical.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm looking at this from a standpoint of what is just, because if you're going to have a law, in my opinion, it ought to be based on justice or what is just, and DUI laws are not just. First of all, DUI laws are a form of what Philip K. Dick coined the term pre-crime in his book Minority Report, which was actually later made into a movie. But pre-crime is when the government charges somebody with a crime before they actually commit it. And that's exactly what DUI is. Of course, DUI is a crime because of the law passed, but no crime is being committed because there are no victims when one is driving drunk in and of itself. So it's made a crime because the state says it's a crime, but there are no victims until that person, because of his or her intoxication, actually damages somebody or harms somebody or their property.
Perhaps it'd be a better term to use to say a victimless crime, because it seems to me that pre-crime is technically not pre-crime because you are committing a crime according to the law. It's just that crime does not have a victim. It's kind of like in the same category as hate crime. That it's separate from the actual criminal behavior. It's an additional charge.
Well, that's right. And when I say pre-crime, I'm borrowing that term from Philip K. Dick. I'm borrowing it because the point, or at least the rationalization from the state, the reason why they have DUI laws is because there's thinking or assuming that anybody who drives while intoxicated will automatically crash and kill somebody or hurt their property. So, with that rationale in mind, they are saying you are going to do this even if you haven't done it already. We, we know you're going to do it. But really, what the government is doing is dealing with probabilities. And when the government deals with probabilities and says that, well, you're probable to commit a crime even if you haven't, that's problematic. And I don't think that's where we want to go with society.
But couldn't we also just say, um, because the DUI laws are there to try to reduce or discourage people from being irresponsible and driving while intoxicated, couldn't we just make the argument instead of eliminating these kinds of laws, which I think is what you're arguing for, and correct me if I'm wrong, um, but
That's right.
instead of eliminating these laws, couldn't we just advocate for raising the blood alcohol level so that it was a little bit closer to a reasonable level? I mean, if we increased it back to maybe what it was, 1.5, that's a level where most people are going to be visibly and obviously intoxicated.
Yeah, I don't agree with that because you still have that issue of checkpoints. You still have that issue of breathalyzers, and you can be arrested for simply having the basically what DUI laws are. It's simply criminalizing somebody for having a certain substance in one's blood during a certain action. So you still have the issue that because basically having alcohol in your blood is criminalized rather than having actual victims, you still have that issue of people are being arrested for actually doing nothing to harm somebody. So the government is still dealing with probabilities, even if those probabilities are greater. Like you said, most people under a certain level of blood alcohol content would be intoxicated, dangerously intoxicated, to the point where they couldn't safely operate a motor vehicle. You still have all the aforementioned problems.
Sure, but at the same time, as a society, we make laws to try to keep the best interest of our society, hopefully, keep the best interest of society flowing along. If we see something that's obviously dangerous, and checkpoints aside at this point, if we just go to the pure blood alcohol level, and we were to put it at a much higher level where it's obvious that a person is intoxicated and should not be driving, I mean, you could have somebody, let's think of something extreme, walk through the Lincoln Memorial juggling flaming knives with a barrel of gasoline on their back, and you could say, well, they're not hurting anybody, just let them do it. Or we could be like, that's endangering public safety, you need to leave, or we're going to cite you or arrest you. You can't be here, just like you can't be on the road. I think there's a lot of laws where we could start to pick them apart and say, well, nobody's been a victim yet, even though this is extremely dangerous. So how should we define that line? Where do we cross over? And do we say in all instances we should not penalize anybody, even if it's a minor penalty, if they haven't done anything to harm anyone else? Or is there any situation in which we say this is extremely dangerous, you shouldn't be doing this?
Well, first of all, I would say that this is the problem of having a publicly owned road or publicly owned property. If there is, let's say you have a private road or a private highway, the owner of the highway or owners of the highway can set these rules and regulations that you agree to before coming onto that property, and then you really have, and if that owner says that if you have, an ounce of alcohol, you're not allowed to drive on the road, or we can, detain you, then that's something that you agree to prior to using that. But the problem is that who determines what is safe and unsafe. I mean, like I said before, the court system should be based on justice. And is it we justice really only can occur when there's a victim to be have restitution for. So if there's a victimless crime, there can't be restitution, and if there's no possible restitution, then you can't really have justice. If that makes sense.
Yes, but I'm sure there are quite a number of people who would critique your definition of justice. And that, I think, is where we would get into contention with these kinds of laws. And some people, at the extreme end of the spectrum, will say that equality is synonymous with justice. And on the other side, you'll have people advocating for personal body autonomy and property rights as the definition of justice. And I think that it is telling of different kinds of ideologies and perspectives in politics and the social sciences as how we define justice is how we are going to these laws are going to flow from those definitions.
Right, and this is the problem when law is based on statutes and law is based on politics and comes from a legislature rather than sort of a common law system where judges hand down rulings generation after generation. But I mean, what is justice is certainly a topic for a whole other discussion. But I do want to point out that everybody has their own little pet issue where they'll say, well, of course, we can't have a war on drugs because if I want to ingest something into my body and I'm not hurting anybody, then who is the government to say that? Well, isn't the same thing in this case? I mean, what's the difference between somebody, if again we're talking about probability. So if I'm at home and I'm drinking and I'm not planning on driving anywhere and I don't drive anywhere, then obviously the probability of me crashing into somebody's house and killing them is pretty low because I'm not in the car. But what's the difference if I decide to get in the car and drive? The probability is certainly higher, but I still haven't hurt anybody.
I'd be really impressed. I had just an image of you crashing into somebody's house and harming them not being in a car. And I guess I had an idea of like the Kool-Aid man busting in through the wall. But getting back to topic, what probability would you say is sufficient? So if we say we can run an unbiased statistical analysis on drunk driving, intoxicated driving, and we're going to say at this level of intoxication, we can say verifiably that 50% of the people will experience a car accident. Or at this intoxication level, we can say that 80% will experience intoxication. I guess what I'm getting at is if we give the statistical analyses that state that at this blood alcohol level, this person is 90% likely to harm themselves or somebody else, is that a position where you'd still say, well, we can't be sure, we still shouldn't make it a law?
Well, absolutely. And it's not just it wouldn't stop at probability. I mean, that's one of the issues that I feel the DUI laws are unjust. There's other reasons, certainly, but yeah, I mean, to me it doesn't matter if one is 99.9% probable of crashing their car because they're intoxicated. It still doesn't mean the laws are just. If the law has an outcome that we want in one specific case, that doesn't mean it is worthy of having or it's a just law in all cases.
Okay. So if we were to take away DUI laws, and we'll take this out of the theoretical for a moment and go into the applied sense, and say we removed the DUI laws completely, I believe that in our current system, in our current society, there would be a massive celebration during which probably in a week's time you'd have hundreds of thousands of people killing themselves on the roads. Because people have, it seems, people have been conditioned to behave animalistically, and it would be like letting the hyena exhibit out of your local zoo, like from between 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. I don't see people in our society right now having the responsibility. And sure enough, this would weed itself out. People would die, and a lot of people would be arrested and thrown in jail for a very long time, and it would eventually work itself out. But going beyond the theoretical, how would we actually implement a system to remove things like DUI penalties?
Well, I think that goes to, it's not so much, well, we need to stop drinking and driving. It's more so we need to encourage, safer, more responsible behavior, and that starts with. I do not advocate tomorrow to flip a switch and say all DUI laws are off the books. I would actually favor a gradual phase out of them. But when we look at the history of drunk driving laws, we don't really have anything to compare it to. If today, there's more cars on the road than there were 30 years ago, and there's more distractions in our cars, and alcohol is easier to get. So we don't have, if we were to phase out the DUI laws, we can't really say, well, if we do that, it's going to go back to this horrible time, because we don't really have anything to compare it to. But yeah, going back to what I first said, is that it all starts with just responsible consumption of alcohol, and passing a law that says you shall be responsible with alcohol, which is essentially what a DUI law is. It doesn't make it so.
Okay, and that's getting at the heart of the issue, because this is one of those laws that is trying to enforce morality, essentially. And this is a major. And I'm not convinced that getting rid of the DUI laws entirely would be a good idea. I'm unconvinced on that, but I do see your point. And actually, as my alternative suggestion, I would advocate for a society that endorses personal responsibility as a means of reducing the problem. So we would need to get back to valuing things like self-determination, personal accountability, care for one's fellow citizens, responsibility for personal behavior, and a care in one's personal health and loved ones and the citizens around us. I think that that's really what it comes down to. When you think about the kind of people that will, not just talking about making a mess up here once or twice, but habitually drive drunk, these people don't have any of those characteristics in their personality. They don't care about themselves. They don't care about their fellow citizens or their loved ones. They usually tell themselves lies to make it okay, and it becomes habitual until something tragic happens. And I think that the real heart of this issue is, and I can get on board with you as far as eliminating the DUI laws if we lived in a different system. I think that I could get on board with that. But not until those values, those cultural values, have been reinstilled, because I don't believe that people in this era really have the responsibility or the character traits to be able to handle. I think it's very sad, but in a lot of different ways, I think that people have become so, again, animalistic and so lacking in critical thinking responsibility that they are actually unable. They're stunted. They're children and mentally, and they are unable to take responsibility for those important decisions.
And I agree with that. Like I said, I am not here to advocate that they all be abolished tomorrow. Sooner rather than later, preferably, but certainly not the next day. What I would say, like for instance, and this is certainly another topic, but I am all in favor of abolishing all welfare programs. But if I was king of the world, I wouldn't do it tomorrow, because I understand that there are people who are dependent on it, and doing that all at once would certainly lead to a chaotic outcome. But you're talking about ways to help resolve how one would deal with drunk driving in the absence of laws against it, why not let people have choices instead of drinking and driving? So there's an article that was written about how Uber actually reduces incidents of drinking and driving because it's easier to, if you've had too much to drink, it's easier to use Uber to get to where you want to go than it would be to use a taxi or call a friend or something. So let's make it easier to, or let's make it legal for there to be more options to get to point A from point B while intoxicated rather than driving.
Oh, and I agree with that entirely. So essentially there's a competition for options there, and that I can get behind fully. We can really eliminate, whether we eliminate DUI laws or not, we can eliminate a lot of the fatalities that go along with drinking and driving if we open up alternative methods of transportation. Now, I often will be the designated driver for friends when we're going out because I'm not drinking, or I would rather have that security and give them that security and allow them to have fun. But for a lot of people, there aren't other options, and it's one of the benefits of living in a city is you have, of course, taxi services, subway, buses, whatever it may be in the city. But if you're not in the city, if you're in the suburbs, or if you're even further out there, there aren't nearly as many options. So it's interesting you brought up Uber, because Uber is one of those expanding industries that actually reaches out into the suburbs. And so that is an option. And I know people who have taken Uber as a means of safe transportation. So there is that option. That's happening right now. What other options do you see that could be put on the market, so to speak, to help reduce alcohol-related fatalities?
Well, the best options, in my opinion, is not something we can do right away. It is to just start privatizing roads, because the problem is with government roads is that most of the traffic fatalities on them, first of all, they're not caused by alcohol. They're caused by bad weather, poor road conditions, and so if the DUI laws are not necessarily about intoxication, considering it's not a crime to drive while being tired, and tired driving is often more dangerous than, especially when you first wake up, you're groggy. People often drive after first waking up. That's more dangerous oftentimes than drinking and driving. Prescription drugs have caused many traffic accidents and fatalities, but with a privatized road system, or at least many privatized roads or more privatized roads, you don't have a socialized road system that is based on the rules of the road are going to be based off of what makes sense. And what I mean by that is that if the owner of the road determines, look, a private road owner may say, you can't, like I said earlier, you can't have 1 ounce of alcohol in your body in order to drive. But if you have market competition in roads, you're going to know eventually, due to basic market forces that we see in every kind of industry, as everything from grocery stores to cars, you're going to know what works best for the consumer, which is the driver on the roads, rather than just put this blanket law that the legislature made up, and they have no idea if it works or not. But that's certainly something we can do, is switch back to, because it's not like government has always owned the roads. This country, the United States, has had a private road system up really until the mid 19th century, is when the government started taking over roads. But that's something I would advocate as well, is just simply start privatizing roads.
And to clarify, for anybody listening who maybe be disconcerted by that idea, when you're talking about private roads, people that would be operating on those private roads presumably would still have to abide by the law of the land. In other words, if they were guilty of vehicular manslaughter on a private road, they are still guilty in the court system, correct?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, that would not change. but the road owner would make specific laws. Like I said, maybe the road owner would say maybe the road owner would say you can't have a blood alcohol content more than you know, 0.01 or something really strict. They may have checkpoints they may hire a security force and have their own checkpoints. I don't know. But that if you're in favor of strict DUI laws, then you actually want to privatize the road, because right now, with the government, you don't have those options because you have to operate through a bureaucracy just to get those. So actually, like I said, if you favor strict DUI laws, then privatize the roads. And then after a period of time, we will know what's the best way to do it. I would argue it's abolishing them, but that's not for me to decide now. That would be for us to, as a collective, to decide once we have empirical evidence.
Okay. And for any of the listeners that it may not sit right with them to talk about privatizing roads, what other kind of options could be put on the table that would help to alleviate alcohol-related fatalities?
Well, there's nothing to say that a car manufacturer can't put a system in place where I don't know, through the evolution of technology, a car manufacturer may say, we have this device that in order for you to turn on the car, you have to pass whatever test. I don't know if it's a breathalyzer or some kind of scan, maybe something, and the car won't operate. So what is the incentive for somebody who may not care about driving drunk? Well, wouldn't they buy a car that doesn't have that? Well, they might, but then again, their insurance might say, look, if you want us to give you insurance, we require you to have these, 10 models of cars that'll ensure that you don't drink and drive. If you don't buy those cars, or you don't have those cars, then we're not going to insure you, or your rates will be, $1,000 a month, or something outrageous. So that's another way, is a combination of, the market between car manufacturers and insurance companies working together to solve a problem.
That's very interesting you brought that up, because I'm sure you probably know there are devices like that right now. Sometimes DUI repeat offenders have to have them installed in their vehicles so they can operate their vehicles.
Yes.
And as soon as you started talking about that, I was thinking, well, how could this be enforced? Insurance benefits, definitely. So you could receive maybe a credit of some sort for installing one in your vehicle, and then have some. I mean, insurance companies love to hand out these promotional benefits, and you could just receive a credit from your insurance company for being essentially a responsible driver and proving it.
Well, that's right. I mean, what is it, Allstate or some kind of insurance company? If you have a teen driver and they get straight A's in school, I mean, they incentivize that by giving you a lower insurance rate. So insurance companies are great at incentivizing people, especially if all of the insurance companies out there say, if you don't buy these cars with these safety mechanisms, then we will not insure you. I mean, right now, insurance companies, if you have a safer car or a newer car with more safety features, your premium is less than if you have an old clunker from the 70s that, barely has a seatbelt.
Another thing I'd like to bring into it, this would be a great alternative, and we're starting to see this technology come out, but I'm very interested in future technologies, and that's automated driving. Who cares about driving around intoxicated if you're not behind the wheel? I think that technology, when it finally takes off, presumably it will, would really change this whole argument. Now, of course, the argument we're having about the potential for state overreach and legislation for morality, that argument would still be there. But this issue itself could be greatly mitigated by just having a computer system do all the driving. And it would be, once you get used to a computer driving you around, at least, it would be a bit refreshing to be able to actually maybe spend time with your passengers and have a few drinks on your way home.
Oh, absolutely. I'm all in favor of any kind of technology that allows people to enjoy more free time. I mean, that's one thing we all want is more spare time, more free time, more leisure time. And if that means that if I have an hour commute every day, and I'm meeting my team at the happy hour at the bar, and I can enjoy myself more there because my car is going to drive home for me, or maybe you can just enjoy yourself in your car. But what I want to stress to people is that if you are concerned about DUIs, then you have to let the market, the free market, solve the problem, because government cannot solve the problem. When you have Uber and Lyft coming in and promoting themselves as sort of a DUI saver, when you have these companies who are trying to invent these driverless cars, when you have these car companies trying to invent new technologies and work with insurance companies, all these are great, but the problem is when the government comes in and says that they can't do this because of whatever regulation, they can't do that, even though it could be life-saving technology. So I would say if you want people to be safer on the roads, if you want lives to be saved, then abolish DUI laws and get the government out of the way of the market and let the market solve the problem itself. I mean, there's 1,000 entrepreneurs out there who want to invent a system, a driverless car system that they can sell to Chevy and Ford and Toyota and become a billionaire. But if there's all these regulations, and there's a lot of regulations and hoops you have to jump through just to invent a driverless car, that's not a very efficient way for people to solve a problem.
Certainly, and I sympathize with your statements on the free market in this regard and elsewhere, but I would add to it my own takeaway for anybody interested is that I'd say the free market in itself is not enough. We also need a culture that endorses strong values and responsibility. I think that any free market system that does not have a strong cultural center to it with those kinds of values attached will eventually descend into some form of chaos.
Well, and I agree with that. It's a combination of social responsibility that certainly the free market can incentivize, but it's more than that. It's a combination of new technologies and collective social responsibility to reduce a very horrendous problem.
Let me ask you something as far as perhaps a compromise in the middle. Would you consider a system under which we eliminated, we'll say, we will eliminate, first of all, eliminate checkpoints, and we'll eliminate DUI as a crime in itself. But if a person is found to be in violation elsewhere, they're swerving on the road, they blow through a stop sign, they're endangering somebody on the road, they will get cited for that infraction, and if they're found to be intoxicated, then we'll also have an additional penalty for the intoxication, but it wouldn't work in reverse. In other words, if somebody were intoxicated but they were driving safely, they wouldn't be penalized, but only if they had already made another violation.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I actually agree to a point, but if you right now, a lot of times when let's say you have people who they're intoxicated and they swerve off the road and crash into somebody's house. A lot of times, and not all, but a lot of times, if they take a plea bargain on that, the state drops drunk driving charge and just sticks them with reckless driving and vehicular assault and destruction of property. So actually, that's a good way to know that DUI laws are kind of pointless because they often drop those charges in a lot of cases. But because you have charges against reckless driving or speeding or vehicular homicide or all of these other laws, you don't actually need DUI laws at all, or you don't even need to charge somebody with drinking and driving. I mean, if I let's say use your example, somebody has one too many to drink, starts speeding and swerving. They go through a stop sign and they crash into somebody who was driving safely, who wasn't intoxicated, who was obeying the traffic law, and kills them. Well, you have a series of violations of crimes that the intoxicated person has committed, that to then charge them with some kind of DUI type infraction, I think is really unnecessary because you have them on all of these other charges. But I see what you're saying. Um, I would take that over what we have now, certainly, to answer your question. But I think the charge of any kind of intoxication while driving is unnecessary.
I see the logic of if we were living in a society that was much more responsible and we had those cultural values to reinforce that personal responsibility and really caring for those around us and taking care with our own futures, our own bodies and minds, and taking care of those around us, and just being aware of all that, I can see myself definitely getting behind your proposal to eliminate these laws. I can. My concern is that we're so far away from that. And I think that we could perhaps take some steps in the direction by like what I was just suggesting through that proposal or something similar to that that would perhaps encourage people to be more responsible while still penalizing them for being irresponsible. So that's where I'm coming from with that proposal. I'm not saying that's necessarily ideal, but something that could perhaps work in moving towards the direction of getting people to be more responsible while also limiting the overreach of potential police departments that want to abuse it.
Absolutely, it's a good middle ground for getting to something that most people would see as a little extreme right now. But it's I if you told me that tomorrow the state, not a state, but the state, the government is going to eliminate checkpoints of any kind for intoxication or even stupid things like seatbelt. You're not wearing your seatbelt. And switch to, say, saturation points where all they do is look for reckless driving. That right there would be a great start. And that's something that, again, I don't think there's any evidence to point to. In a lot of cases, there's the opposite, that checkpoints don't do anything. So if you were to just eliminate checkpoints, I think that would be a great step towards where I think we should eventually be.
Okay. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. I just I'm anxious to get off of this call because I'm ready to imbibe.
Very good. Well, thank you for coming on again, and thank you for the listeners that are out there. If you want us to go more, as always, let us know. Let us know your own opinions on this topic. Do you have a better argument? If so, put it in the comments below. If you'd like us to go deeper into the topic, write some suggestions down. We'll consider doing that. Thank you very much, and do not drink and drive ever. Just trust me, it's not worth it. Just always drive sober, and you'll be fine.